help you, show you what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it sounds like. As the most dramatic illustration of that, I can tell you that when I was writing about Dawson City in the middle of the gold rush, so this is a city that in the late 1890s went from 300, 400 Han people, First Nations, on the bank, where the Klondike River flows into the Yukon River, just 300 people living there. By 3 years later, there are 30,000 people living there. It's the center of the gold fields, 30,000 people, and 3 public toilets. That's what history smells like. So I thought maybe crime would be a way in to show people what it was like to be there. I put the word out among all my friends, my historian friends, my lawyer friends, legal historians, and said, got any good crimes? Anything you'd recommend I look at? And I have to say that I was actually quite shocked. You know that thing about peace, order, and good government? Ladies and gentlemen, up to a point. There are some pretty good sleaze in our background. I mean, did you realize, for example, that there was a premier of Alberta in the 1930s who was finally bumped from his job for having sex with an underage woman, and he kept denying it, and he told this young woman, according to her story, that she needed to answer his demands, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to govern the province. This was a revelation to me. But the one story that I heard that I thought, that is absolutely fascinating, was about the Massey Murder. And one of the reasons that this was so interesting to me was it was the Masseys. It was an event that happened in 1915, which I'm going to tell you about in just a minute, but it was an event involving the family that in 1915, I doubt there were very many people in Canada who had not heard of. Because the Masseys, at that stage, it was Massey Harris at that stage, the largest agricultural implement machinery manufacturer in the British Empire. Massey Harris was the biggest employer in Toronto and in Ontario. It was a huge concern. Every farmer out west was reliant on Massey Harris agricultural implements. The richest, most powerful family in Canada, not most beloved, because Hart Massey, the great founder of who really developed the business, his father had actually run the small village blacksmith from which it had all grown. Hart Massey was not a lovable person. He was the most tight-lipped Methodist you can ever imagine. But he'd been generous to Toronto. The Fred Victor Mission, the Massey Hall, the organ, countless Methodist churches. This was a huge family. I can't even think of an equivalent today. Maybe the Westons, but I haven't yet discovered a murderer there. But I mean, a really big, big deal. And nobody today knew about it. Why? Now, what's going on there? So I heard about this event. The other reason I was particularly interested in researching this one was that it occurred in February 1915. And when I began my research, I knew that we were just about to enter into a whole period of memorials for the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And I knew that pretty well all the official memorials and remembrances would actually be about what had happened in Europe, what had happened to Canadian troops who had gone over there, those young men, so brave, so willing in the early months, and had been slaughtered in the trenches. I mean, outside you can see the wonderful war memorial Shelburne has, and the lists of young men, and all war memorials across Canada. Many of them have fallen from both the First World War and the Second World War. The First World War lists are always at least double the size of the Second World War. Communities, small towns, villages across Canada lost many of those eager young volunteers that had marched out. And I knew that we were going to remember them and their misery in the trenches and what that war had done for Canada's self-image and Canada in international politics. But I always wanted to know, so what happened on the home front? What was it like for the mothers, the wives, the daughters, the sons, the children? I wanted to know sort of what was it like being so far from hostilities and just waiting for casualty lists. So both the period, 1915, was very interesting to me, and the story itself had an immediate attraction because I thought Massey, that's a big name. What happened was, on a Monday evening, a chilly Monday evening in February 1915, Bert Massey was walking along Walmer Road. He was walking home, and he knew his wife Rhoda was not waiting for him at the house because she'd gone to visit her family in the States, and also there was some friction in that marriage. I was never entirely able to pin it down, but the family will acknowledge it was not a happy marriage. He knew, though, Bert Massey knew that his son, Charles, was going to be home, and he expected to be served supper by Carrie, the 18-year-old maid. He met a newspaper boy, Ernest Peltier, as he was walking down the street, and Peltier asked him for the quarter that he owed for the Star, that he delivered daily to the house on Walmer Road. Bert Massey gave him a quarter, turned into his driveway, into his walkway, walked up to his front door. The front door opened. There was Carrie, holding Bert's own revolver, and she shot him. Point blank range, in cold blood. And he staggered back, and he said, no, no. She shot again, and then she closed the door. He reached the sidewalk and collapsed. Imagine. I mean, this is Toronto. And I just want to tell you something very funny. The other day I was talking to Maureen Jennings, who writes the Murdoch mystery books, and we were talking about crime in early Toronto. And I said, you know, I went through all the police records for the late 19th and early 20th century years, the annual police reports, and I said, murder was so rare. There were only one or two. And she said, I know, and I've written 87. Murder was very rare. Many of the people who heard that gun go off thought it was the new electric lights that had been installed. They assumed it was a bulb popping. But finally somebody realized there was a man lying on the ground. They rushed up to him, and they quickly ascertained, there was no blood around, but they quickly ascertained he was in a very bad way. They carried him into a neighboring house and called the police. The police arrived. The police sergeant knocked on the front door, no answer. He walked in, it was unlocked. He called up and he said, is there anybody here? And he just didn't see anybody on the ground floor, walked up to the second floor, heard a voice from the attic saying, come and get me, I'm up here. And he said, no, no, you come down. And down comes this quite pathetic creature, a young girl. She was 18, but you know, you look at photos of her, and by today's standards, we think probably she was 14. She was pretty undernourished. She was wearing a threadbare cloth coat, and she was carrying the gun, but this time she was carrying it by the barrel, and she was offering him the handle, and he just stared up in amazement. He hadn't yet realized who had been shot. But he took her to the police station, the local police station, and when they started taking down the details of exactly what had happened, and she mentioned that her employer was Mr. Massey, they realized that this was going to be a major scandal, and it couldn't be handled just at the local police station. So they took Carrie down to Court Street Police Station, which was just behind the old courthouse on Adelaide Street. That was the event. That was the shooting. And so there was never any doubt who had shot Bert Massey. The question was, why? And Carrie had said quite specifically, he tried to ruin me. But what did that mean? I mean, we know now what we think he tried to ruin would mean, but we would automatically be sympathetic to Carrie. Most people then were not automatically sympathetic to an 18-year-old girl who had no business holding a gun. And so the story is what happened in the 3 weeks between Carrie shooting her employer and her trial on murder charges in the Ontario Supreme Court at the end of February. I was describing this whole project that I was going to do to a bunch of judges and lawyers at one point, and they said, just a minute. What did you say? 3 weeks between commission of crime and verdict? They said, are you sure you really want to put us in such a bad light? 3 weeks now. I mean, we're going to have 6 weeks just on the trial of Mike Duffy. And gosh, no, who knows when the verdict is going to be. Anyway, so I then had this wonderful challenge of the architecture of my book being quite clear, that I would go through those 3 weeks, sort of almost day by day, with what was in the foreground, what was happening to Carrie. Appearing in the police court, the coroner's inquest the following night, Carrie being taken to Don Jail, what happens to her in Don Jail, how she gets a lawyer, a second hearing in the coroner's court, what the newspapers and the other actors are doing until she finally arrives in what was then called New City Hall, but is now Old City Hall, where the Superior Court sat. And then, of course, the drama of the trial, extensively covered in all of the six newspapers that Toronto had at that stage, the drama of the trial and what the verdict was. That was the architecture of the book. But in between, I could tell you what Toronto was like. What was it like to actually live there? And of course, that's what I really wanted to do, because what I wanted to do was to show how the verdict, and now this is a spoiler alert, she walks, she gets away with it. She shot a man in cold blood, and she got away with it. And it probably wouldn't happen today. She was not declared insane, which would be one of the issues that would arise today. Although, in fact, at one point, the Massey family probably were pressing that. They were so keen to bury this whole issue. The Massey family were trying to see if there could be a psychiatric evaluation of her that would declare her as not in the state of mind to know what she was doing. She walked. Why? And then I could go into the fact that Toronto was a city on the cusp of change. Toronto, although it is so stuffy, so rigid by some definitions, with the old, a very sort of static class system with the old Ontario families, the family compact families at the top of the layer, then the successful industrialists like Massey on the next layer, then the sort of growing middle class of lawyers and small businessmen. And then all the blue-collar workers building small houses, the city rapidly extending beyond its original boundaries. Although at one level it seemed so static, it was actually a city in dramatic transition. It was a city in transition from being about 200,000 people at the beginning of the century to nearly 250,000 now. It was being a city, nearly 500,000 now, sorry. It was a city in which there were large numbers of British blue-collar workers coming in until war broke out in 1914. all coming determined to escape the class system of Britain, determined to make new lives for themselves in the new world, and not wanting to remain in the oppressive, industrial, dark, dirty, filthy cities of Britain in the late 19th century. It was a city where the women's movement, the early suffragettes, were really beginning to demand that their voices were heard in city government and provincial government and federal government, as well as the men's. It was a city knowing that the war in Europe that had started only a few months earlier was not the war they'd expected. Because young men, 25,000 young men had volunteered in August, September 1914 to go to the war that had been declared in Europe. And most of them had actually spent the winter, 21,000 had spent the winter in Salisbury, in the south of England, being trained, being turned into an army. But many of them had gone saying it's going to be over by Christmas, and they've got to be part of this big adventure, this crusade against the Hun, this crusade to show what was right and what was beautiful and to support the British Empire. And it was rapidly becoming clear that that wasn't at all what it was going to be like. It wasn't a wonderful crusade. It was industrial-scale massacre. And they were going to be over there for a long time. And the first casualty lists were beginning to appear. So there was an uncertainty, there were tremors of unease throughout the city. There was a growing distrust of both what the British government and the British generals were demanding from the troops, and also why was Canada, remind me why Canada was fighting Britain's war? In fact, most Canadians at that stage thought of themselves as Britishers. They were full-on imperial supporters. But nonetheless, there was an unease. There was a sense of, wait a minute, are our voices being heard in what's going on? And at the same time, although it's an 85% British city, Toronto, there were more and more immigrants from elsewhere coming in and shaking some of those sort of British assumptions. There were immigrants coming in from Central Europe. There were immigrants coming in from Italy, from Spain. There were people of different religious groups. There was a growing Jewish community. They were absolutely shunned, and the anti-Semitism was absolutely rife in the Toronto of 1915. But nonetheless, it was a city that was nervous. And this gets caught up in the Carrie Davis trial, because Carrie Davis is lucky enough to get a very smart lawyer, Hartley Dewart. And one of the things that Hartley Dewart does is realize that he's going to play to the jury. And he makes sure that the jury, the 12 men who sit on the jury, there are no women allowed on the jury in this period in our history, not until, in fact, much, much later. Hartley Dewart makes sure that all the men who are sitting on the jury are old enough to be Carrie's father. And then he talks about how Carrie's father was a British soldier who was wounded in the pursuit of duty when he was in the Boer War. And then he also talked about what a strict, good man Carrie's father, who died some years earlier, had been, and his daughter had come over to be a very well-behaved servant. And he builds on the whole idea that Carrie is defenseless, and Carrie needs, the victim of this crime was not Bert Massey, the dead man on the sidewalk. It was Carrie Davis, because Bert Massey had tried to ruin her. The other thing that happened in this trial that I found fascinating and quite difficult to get my head around is that we only actually ever heard the full story of what Bert Massey had done to Carrie Davis in the trial itself. Not in any of the publicity coming up to it, not in the police hearings building up to it, but only in the trial itself. And sometimes there was a little voice in my head that said, Hartley Dewart, this clever lawyer, has really coached his client well. She really knows what she's meant to be saying. I wonder if it really happened. And it was up to me as the writer to decide how I was going to, whether I was going to raise that question in the text, because I don't know. All I could judge from were the 3 times I heard Carrie's voice as I was doing my research. One was in her preliminary interview with the police on the night of the murder. One was when she speaks in the trial itself, when Hartley Dewitt questions her during the murder trial, and one is in an interview that she gave the Toronto Star 2 days after the verdict was rendered. And I had to decide whether she was as innocent as her lawyer presented her. Those of you who've read the book will decide will see what I decided. But I wanted to leave it open because I didn't feel that this is non-fiction. I can't tell you the answer to that question. So, as you can see, it's a great story, and there are all these different streams I could explore. For example, also the role that newspapers played, because the 2 major newspapers at that stage for the most working class Torontonians were the Evening Telegraph and the Evening Telegram and the Toronto Star, and they took different views of what had happened. The Evening Telegram decided that Carrie needed championing. They portrayed her as the victim of the crime, whereas the Toronto Star stuck with the view that the dead man was actually the victim of the crime, a not unreasonable conclusion, given that he wasn't there to tell his story. But the newspapers themselves, one of the great joys, in fact, of historical research, as I suspect some of you know, is when you have to look and see on old paper or in the archives when you're going through the reels of newspapers on film, is just you're following a story, and every day I go through all the Evening Telegram coverage of the trial, and I'd always get distracted by the advertisements for whatever Eaton's Monday special was, or how much it cost to hire a upstairs maid, downstairs maid, housekeeper or chauffeur, the political news of the day, and what Mondays were always fascinating because there you get reviews of sermons in many of the newspapers. So you've got a real sense of this society and sort of what people turn to their newspapers for, because of course newspapers were the only source of information. Not only no internet, no live stream feeds, no television, no movies, no radio. All you had were the newspapers and gossip. And frankly, they were sometimes exactly the same thing. But that hasn't changed. But the newspapers played a big role in terms of manipulating public opinion around this trial. I had as my sources newspapers, the 3 sources for Carrie's own personality as shown in the interviews. I had some secondary sources, quite a lot of legal analysis of the case. I also had all the background material that I could go through, police records and annual reports. Because she's acquitted, I did not have an official transcript of the murder trial. And sometimes, oh my gosh, sometimes I wish that she'd been convicted, because then there would have been in Library and Archives Canada a proper transcript. But because it was such a big deal at the time, it knocked the First World War off the front pages. I could pretty well get what was happening from the different accounts in the different newspapers. I quickly learned which newspaper reporters obviously had the best shorthand and were therefore the most accurate in recording the interrogations and witness statements. One thing I couldn't get, and the Masses, I have to say, the Masses were extremely helpful. They don't have a lot of family records, but But they all kept saying, oh, isn't this interesting that you're writing this book? Because we don't know anything about it. We'd really like to know what did happen. It was always, nobody ever spoke about what Bert Massey had done. I had managed to get in touch through the generosity of Frank Jones, a Toronto Star reporter who had looked at this case in the 1980s. I managed to get in touch with Carrie Davis's granddaughter and daughter, who was still alive, both called Margaret. And I called and said, I'm doing this book, and I'd very much like to come and talk to you, because I want to make sure that you're comfortable with what I'm doing, and I want to make sure you know the kind of writer I am. And Margaret, the daughter, was not very well at the moment. She was a woman in her 90s, and she told her daughter, Margaret, she said, no, I don't want to talk about it. I won't talk about it. And so I said to Carrie's granddaughter, Margaret, may I come and see you? And she said, no, I'm sorry. I appreciate the phone call. She's very, very gracious, but she said, no, we don't want to be any part of it. When I published the book, I was sitting in a public library where I talked about it in Toronto, and there was a line of people, the kind of line that gratifies every author's heart, because they bought the books and they wanted me to sign it. And then finally at the end there was a woman, a rather shy woman, who came up, and she had a book, and she said, I'm Carrie's granddaughter. And I said, Margaret, this is terrific, I'm thrilled and honoured to meet you. Do you think I got it right? And she said, well, I'll tell you something you did that worried me. At the end of the book, I do give a sort of brief synopsis of what Carrie Davis's life was like after she had been acquitted. I didn't know a lot of facts, but I put in the facts that I knew. And I made it play. I said it was a hand-to-mouth life, because there was never very much money, and she died early. And I implied, in fact, that she was always a rather, not just a timid woman, but also, she's not particularly happy.